recorded in Luke. The apostles said to Jesus, "Increase our faith." And Jesus answered, "If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to the mulberry tree, 'Uproot yourself and plant yourself in the sea,' and it would obey you. If one of you had hired help plowing a field or herding sheep, and they came in from the fields, would you say to them, 'Come and sit at my table'? Wouldn't you say instead, 'Prepare my supper, put on your apron and wait on me, and while I eat and drink'? You can eat and drink afterward. Would you be grateful to the workers who were just doing their job? It's the same with you who hear me. When you have done all you have been commanded to do, say, 'We are simple workers. We have done no more than our duty.'" The Gospel of Christ. Please be seated. So today, all over the world, churches of all sorts of denominations will gather to celebrate World Communion Sunday. It's an opportunity for us to embrace the embodiment of the infinite variety that exists within the communities of the followers of the way. And today we uphold the reality that no matter how communion is celebrated, the followers of the way, we are all companions. For to be a companion is literally to share bread together. The word companion is made up of two Latin words, one com, which means with or together, and panis, which means bread. To break bread together is to be a companion. Humans began engaging in the sacred act of breaking bread together generations and generations and generations before Jesus embraced the sacred act of sharing a meal to strengthen the bonds of companionship among his followers. Now, how many of you remember the very first time you participated in the companionship of communion? Do you remember the first time you had communion? I suspect, because we're all of a certain age, that when we had our first communion, the communion practices were a little less inclusive than they are today. I think that goes without saying. For several generations, many mainline denominations, we tried to limit communion to those who had been properly instructed in the meaning of communion. In Lutheran churches, children often had to wait until they were confirmed in order to be welcome at the table. Back then, communion wasn't so much celebrated as it was endured. It was a sort of ritual of penance, and the whole service was very penitential. And fortunately, we've come a long way from the somber communion rites of our past. But I suspect that many of us still carry the residues of less than life-affirming theologies that taught us to view communion as a sort of ritual that needs to be endured as a way to remember a blood sacrifice, a kind of, I hate to use this phrase this week in particular, a kind of quid pro quo for our sinfulness. I can still remember my very first communion. It was, for all sorts of reasons, a life-changing experience. Fortunately for me, my first communion was free from all the trappings of penitence. There was little or no thought of a blood sacrifice for sin. You see, my first communion happened by way of what some would call an oversight or an accident, but I think of it as a grace-filled divine blessing. As I've told you before, I didn't grow up in the church. My family's experiences in Belfast had shown us the worst that the church has to offer. And my brother and I were never encouraged to go anywhere near any kind of church, ever. We were baptized when we were infants, but that was some kind of cosmic insurance policy that my parents took out because they felt they had to. We were baptized, and then we never went back. I was an incredibly lonely teenager. I had spent my entire childhood and most of my teenage years moving from place to place, country to country, school to school. I was always the new kid because we were always on the move. And I learned very early not to make friends. You don't make friends with people, because if you do, it's going to be that much more painful when you move. Longing and loneliness were predominant emotions that characterized the deep homesickness of my younger self. And looking back on my younger self, I can see a little girl who was homesick for a home she never really knew, because when you move about as much as we did, no place ever feels like home. Eventually, all you feel is this deep longing for something you can't even name, a place that you don't even know. So one day, at the tender age of 15, a new acquaintance at high school, tempted me to change my ways and actually start a friendship. She kept inviting me to come to church with her. She was a pastor's kid, and pastor's kids were kind of in the fishbowl. Doug, you may know this, you function in a fishbowl. And they had Friendship Sundays, and the pastor's kid was expected to bring a friend on Friendship Sundays. Now, I say that Valerie invited me to come to church with her, but the truth is she bribed me to come to church with her, and I was curious enough about church itself and about this new person in my life, so I accepted her bribe. And that's how I found myself in a Lutheran church on a 5th Sunday in the month. Now, some of you who are Lutheran will know that in addition to the festivals like Easter and Christmas and All Saints' Day and a few other festivals like that, if the month happened to have 5 Sundays in it, we would celebrate communion. Communion was something that was to be endured back then, and so we didn't celebrate it every Sunday. That didn't happen until the liturgical renewal movement of the 70s and 80s. Anyway, there I was, a total newbie. I had never been to a worship service in my life that I could remember. And I was sitting in worship, having endured the sermon, and wondering when it would all be over and we could go back to Valerie's house for lunch, when this strange ritual was announced called Holy Eucharist. I don't know. What's a Eucharist, right? Made me a little nervous. I had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. And by the time people began to be ushered up into the lines, I was really aware that I was out of place. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was expected. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me. And I remember leaning over to Valerie's mother, who earlier had announced that I should call her by her first name. Oh my goodness. Anyway, I leaned over to Lola and asked her what I should do. And Lola, sensing that I might not be a Lutheran, asked gently what I wanted to do. And I said, I don't know. What should I do? She gently said, you are welcome to share some bread and some wine with everyone as a way of remembering Jesus. I was 15. Bread, I knew. I'd never tasted wine before. Sounded like forbidden fruit to me. Okay. And remembering Jesus didn't seem like a bad idea to me. I knew a little something about Jesus, and I kind of liked this guy that I saw as a social revolutionary. I was very interested in history and politics even back then, and I was attracted to Jesus' politics. I had read the New Testament, but remembering Jesus was not the hook that got me up to that altar to receive my first communion. What motivated me back then is what continues to motivate me now. I was invited to share something special, something extraordinary with people who until that very moment were strangers that were willing to include me. There's nothing quite like the possibility of being included, especially when you've lived your life as an outsider. Nothing quite like that to open you up to all sorts of possibilities. I remember remembering Jesus. I remember the small wafer that the pastor called the body of Jesus, and the ever so little sip of wine, which I had never tasted before. I remember thinking it odd to call this little sip of wine the blood of Christ, but all of this paled in comparison to remembering that I was included in something very special because these nice people insisted that this bread and wine was given and shed for me. For me, I was included. I didn't have the vocabulary to name my feelings back then. And looking back, the word companionship captures the overwhelming emotion of being included. Looking back on my first communion, I am all too aware that it could have gone very differently indeed. Lola could have told me that I should wait in my seat while those who had been instructed in the meaning and purpose of communion were served. She could have been gracious about it and suggested that if I wanted to learn more about communion, we could talk about it after the service. But she didn't follow the rules which she had been taught. Instead, she simply said, "Would you like to join us for some bread and some wine?" I don't remember how I answered her. I just remember the gentle way that Lola guided me to the aisle and waited with me. It was kind of like she was supporting me. She was so close. And she showed me how to cup my hands. And she quietly explained that I could take a sip, just a little sip, from the cup of wine. And I remember watching as people kneeled at the altar rail. And I remember Lola encouraging me with a look as together we cupped our hands in anticipation. And I remember feeling included, a part of something so much bigger than myself. I remember worrying that I was about to be struck by lightning, by God, because I had no idea if I even believed in God or cared that Jesus might have something to do with God. And so I figured if there was a God, this was all going on in my head at the same time, if there is a real God, I'm in big trouble. But most of all, I remember wanting to know more about what it might mean to have this thing called faith. For faith was what these wonderful, welcoming people had, and I desperately wanted some of their faith. Jesus responds to his disciples' plea for more faith by telling them a parable. Jesus says, wait just a minute, you don't really need all that much faith. All you need is a little bit, no bigger than a mustard seed. Just a little faith can move mountains or mulberry bushes or whatever else you want to move. Notice Jesus' response to the disciples' request for an increase in faith. He doesn't talk about believing more of anything. He doesn't talk about believing with more conviction, or believing in a better way, or believing all of it. Jesus' response has nothing whatsoever to do with belief. It focuses on doing. Faith is the power to accomplish something, to accomplish even the impossible. If the disciples had faith, Jesus says, the size of even a mustard seed, they could command a mountain to jump in a lake, and it would, or a mulberry bush, to uproot itself and be planted in the sea, and it would obey. Jesus is not very subtle. His rhetoric is quite clear, but somehow, maybe it's because it's more convenient for us, we tend to miss the point that Jesus is trying to make. Maybe it's easier that way. After all, if we hear what Jesus is saying, it may have major consequences in our life. We might actually have to do something. Because faith is a way of life. Faith is not about believing anything. Faith is about deep-seated confidence. It's about trust. And belief is more like an opinion. We can believe something to be true without it ever making any difference in our lives. We can say, I know if that is true, then I have to do this. But we can slip and we can say, I believe it. I believe it. I believe it. I believe that my relative wealth is the result of an economic system that oppresses the poor. I believe it. I can believe that as strongly or as deeply as I want to believe it without ever doing anything at all about it. Faith is trusting that there's a better way and embarking down that pathway. Faith has nothing to do with waiting around until we have all our ducks in a row, or until we understand everything, or know everything, or are confident about anything. Faith is just taking off down that pathway, trusting that we will find a way. You don't really need a whole lot of faith to change reality. Just a little dab will do you. 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 faithful people can change the world. It happens all the time. Each and every day, faithful people manage to change the world. You don't need more than a mustard seed's worth of faith to change reality. Faith is not about believing or understanding or knowing. Faith is about doing. I will always be grateful to Lola for the way in which she faithfully embodied grace, and without knowing or understanding anything about me, she opened up a whole new way of being in the world to me. And even though I didn't understand or know or believe, Lola's little bit of faith was and is a gift, a blessing for which I shall always be grateful. Today on this World Communion Sunday, we are all invited to consider the wonders that our little bit of faith can accomplish in the world. And this, dear brothers and sisters, is the companionship that we share. The companionship of faith that can empower, nourish, ground, and sustain us as we follow the way of the one who embodied the love that we call God, in ways that inspire the kind of faith that trusts that simple acts of human kindness, however small, have the power to change the world. Just a little dab of faith will do you. For it is in the doing that faith has the power to move mountains. Let us break bread together, dear friends. Just a little bread and a little wine will do. Just a little, and we shall be companions. And then let us embody our faith by doing the work of love. Amen.